Today, for the very first of our Jargon-Free Insights, we're interviewing once again Gregg McClymont MP. Gregg's you'll probably know Gregg's the Labour Party's shadow pensions minister. He's been very active in pensions since he took on his new role last year. He's been very active in pensions since he took on that role. And if you've been following the proceedings in Parliament over the last few weeks, you'll know that he's got some very strong opinions on Nest and the restrictions on Nest, and also the way that the state second pension and the state basic pension are being merged together, melded together into one super pension. And that's what our discussion today is going to be about. Back then, when we were speaking a few weeks ago, we were talking about the new state pension and the fact that the state second pension's been we now know it's going to be finished from 2017. But there's this big issue, isn't there, of winners and losers, and I know that's something you've been speaking just in the last few days in Parliament about.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Nice to be with you again. Yes, the state pension white paper, it was trailed by the government as a simpler reform, which was also going to be more generous to significant groups within society, and that it was overall and in all aspects a better system than the current one. I think once you work your way through the detail, and of course I raised this at the outset, the devil will be in the detail, then the picture alters somewhat. It seems from my analysis of the white paper and building on the work that the IFS did very quickly, that in the long term most people lose. Most people will get less state pension than they would have under the current system once you get into 2030, 2040, 2050. And that does raise a big question about is there an agreement within society that the state should retreat from state pension provision? Should you get less state pension? And then that raises questions about what the private pensions market has to do to potentially fill that gap.
No, that does put a different slant on these reforms in a way, doesn't it? Because, of course, we've always had the basic state pension, but what most people probably don't understand is that we've had a state second pension that's been earnings related. We've had that for 50 years now. 1961 we first, and the state second pension came in, the graduated pension scheme as it was then SERPs, State Earnings Related Pension Scheme, is now called S2P. But most people have never heard of it. That's a fact. But it's been right that the state second pension was essentially a company pension scheme for people whose employers didn't provide one, and it's earnings related benefits, which is quite weird for a state pension scheme to give earnings related benefits. So the more you earn, the more you paid in national insurance, and the bigger the benefit you got from the state second pension system in all its forms, broadly speaking. That's gone, and it's bound to become more redistributive, which is why when I heard you say that before, I thought, well, there are bound to be winners and losers. If you still pay earnings related national insurance and you get a flat benefit, then higher earners are transferring wealth of theirs to lower earners. And that's kind of the level I saw it as, and I thought that's quite good. Not good in itself, but good because the flat overall benefit gets rid of this mass means testing. But what you're arguing now, I think, is that it is flat and it is redistributive, yes, but most people will lose out, I think you said. So that's a distinctly different...
and I think the way to... Because perhaps what I said and the way you put it don't necessarily square up. I think the point of contention between our two opening set of remarks is that the additional state pension, this earnings related part, was particularly focused, as I understand it, on the lower paid. Yeah. So actually, those who earned less got a much bigger accrual rate, percentage-wise.
That's right, those changes were made.
So the idea that it was in line with your earnings seems to me not quite the case. That actually, the way the second state pension, and this has always been the case, worked, is that it worked to the advantage of those who earned less, as long as you were earning, and the way the thresholds worked. And actually, by taking away the second state pension, there's a big question mark about how that plays out. When you're saying redistributive, it may be redistributive to certain groups, but it's not clear it's to the low paid. And we're continuing to analyse this, but I raise that as an issue, that by getting rid of SERPs, second state pension, there's potentially a significant loss for what we would not consider to be high paid and high salaried sections of society.
So if that's right, and I'm sure your analysis is, because when we spoke before, the white paper had only just come out. So, but if that's right, then auto-enrolment, which we're all hoping will succeed, really has to, doesn't it?
Well then, I mean, you raise a very good question, because one wonders, and I'm looking at this as we speak, if the new system is significantly less generous over the long term than the old system, then what does auto-enrolment do to that picture? Does auto-enrolment more than replace the loss under the end of the old system, or does it bring people back up to what they would have got under the state system, or does it give people more when you combine the new state pension and auto-enrolment than they would have under the old system without auto-enrolment? I'm continuing to look into that. Again, provisionally, it looks like for some of those who are in lower income categories, the new system plus auto-enrolment just about takes you back to where you started. But
there is a shift in probably people's thinking, you'd hope, wouldn't you, that because the mass means testing of the past, or certainly the recent past, might become a thing of the past, that every pound you save will be worth a pound in value to you, which it hasn't always been. It pays to save, I think it's fair to say, is the prize we've got from that. Perhaps if it pays to save, and it genuinely feels that it pays to save for an average person, they may save more than the bare minimum required. I mean, that has to be the bet, doesn't it? That it would spark off genuine pension saving.
That is the best case for the new system, which is simplification, which I think everyone welcomes as an idea, will lead people to understand what they're getting and then make adequate provision themselves. And that is a very legitimate point of view, and I've got great sympathy for that. I think in terms of this debate about the single state pension, the government started off by saying this is a simpler system and it's a more generous system. They've then moved to a situation of saying it's a simpler system and it's no more generous than the current system. I think the debate might end up in a position where the government is forced to concede that it's a simpler system, but actually it's a less generous system. And then that changes the terms of the debate. It doesn't remove the attraction of simplicity, but it leads us into territory where, as a parliament, as a pensions industry, as a wider society, there needs to be a conversation about what constitutes adequate state pension provision.
Yeah, was this properly discussed in those terms before it was implemented, that kind of thing?
Well, look, you know as well as I do that it looks like the new system combines the desire of the DWP for simplification and the desire of the Treasury for savings.
As I understand it, the money raised by this tax hike will not be reinvested into the new state pension, but flows straight into Treasury coffers. Is that indeed the case? How much money does this tax grab raise, and why is the money not being reinvested into the new state pension?
And it was always trailed by George Osborne and by Steve Webb that this new system would be cost neutral. But of course it turns out it's not cost neutral, it's cost beneficial to the Treasury, which is why there must be and are huge swathes of losers. In fact, in the long term, more or less everybody except the self-employed. And I just think that aspect has to be opened up and debated. Do we agree that reducing the state's role in direct pension provision is a good thing? And what are the implications of that? And, can auto-enrolment pick up the slack?
We're talking about simplification, and there are these restrictions on Nest that were imposed when the legislation was first put through, but they've come up, they've been under scrutiny with the Work and Pensions Committee lately, and I think the committee's come out and said that they don't see any real reason for those restrictions to be there. For people like me, and there were many of us in the industry who fought long and hard over a decade ago for simplification of our pension system. I mean, back then we had 3 separate sets of legislation, which were anachronistic. It was, we never changed anything in the past, and some people even argued that we had 8 different sets of rules depending on which scheme you were in, when you joined it, and who you were, and whether you had brown shoes or black shoes. All that's nonsense. And that was a big political debate that went on for over a decade, and we finally got acceptance of that, and the government accepted it at the time, and in 2006 we had our simplified pensions regime introduced. And here we are, just a couple of years after that, with the 2008 Act coming out, we're adding another regime, it seems to me, or another set of rules. We've now got different sets of rules if you're in Nest, and different rules if you're not in Nest. To me, that's plain crazy. I know there are arguments against having the restrictions for all sorts of reasons, but I can't believe that a pension community that I'm part of works so hard to push out all these different rules for different people, and within a couple of years after we've done that, we're bringing them back in again. Now, I know you've been maybe following a different line on that, but some of the things I've read that you've said in the House over the last few weeks, I mean, it is crazy, isn't it, that Nest is treated as a different pension scheme to others?
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, I think the position you set out, I would agree with. There are different interests, of course, in different parts of the pensions industry, and people will inevitably try and, argue from their particular interest. But it seemed to me from a very early stage, and as you know, I've been clear for, I guess a year now, that the Nest restrictions can and should be lifted. From a policy point of view, simply because Nest was set up to drive down costs and charges in the auto-enrolment space alongside good practice and governance. And it's had an effect already. We can see that in some of the deals which big employers are getting from Nest competitors. And it seems to me to allow Nest to complete that process, it's not so much about Nest itself, it's about Nest's role as driving, creating greater competition in the marketplace. The policy case for lifting the Nest restrictions is clear. We know big employers have difficulties with Nest. Nest have said this themselves, understandably, because you can't enrol those who are on high salaries into Nest. So if you want to use Nest, you have to use 2 different pension providers, and big companies are going to be loath to do that. And that's the policy case. And then the government's initial position was, well, you might say that, and that may or may not be true, but EU law prevents us doing so. In response to that, I commissioned from my office legal advice, setting out a legal opinion, which the legal opinion was very clear that there's no reason for the Nest restrictions not to be lifted as long as the government's prepared to go to Brussels and make the prima facie case that it's no longer a state aid. And the government now appears to be moving in the direction of taking that case seriously. Okay. And the DWP committee, I think, are putting further pressure on, just because the case for lifting restrictions and increasing competition seems so clear. But
Nest is crucial to the reforms. Not everybody realises this, or maybe the people that watch videos like this realise it, but Nest may not turn down any business, however small. So even a tiny company, a chip shop or something like that, if they apply to Nest, then they must accept them. So Nest is absolutely crucial, and really, to my way of thinking, that they should be on a level playing field with everybody else at least.
Set Nest free, Steve, I quite agree.
Well, if Nest fails, the reforms fail. Yeah, because we need a default position for the smaller employer. And we're not there yet. Auto-enrolment so far has only gone through the larger employers.
No, and that's a huge point. Of course, this is about the deal that the smaller employers will get. Most employees in the UK are employed in small and medium-sized enterprises rather than the big employers. And there's a big debate about making sure that auto-enrolment is in the right place for small and medium-sized employers. Of course, alongside Nest, you've got the People's Pension, you've got Now, you've got some of the big insurance companies who are in there at the moment and providing big employers with good deals, which appear to be good deals. I've got no doubt that's significantly the case. But for those smaller employers, to make sure that it's fit for purpose for when they stage into auto-enrolment, I can't better your analysis of why Nest matters.
Well, and I mean, I meet loads of small employers because of the nature of our business, but they want to comply by and large. But if it's difficult, you know, and if you put obstacles in the way, I don't think that's particularly helpful. Yeah. The numbers that you gave earlier are right. There are about 1.3 million employers in the UK with one or more employees who are affected by this legislation, but about 1 million of them have fewer than 10 employees. So the vast majority of the firms affected by these reforms are small micro employers, and I think it's I'm not sure that doing the large firms first as a test for how it will play out in the small firms is entirely valid. But I do know, that's not the reason it was done.
I think there's reasons why it's happened that way, I'm sure, but that is a very legitimate point. I mean, the big employers we know have got the muscle and expertise.
Well, I know for a fact that my chip shop doesn't have a HR department.
Yeah. Yes.
Because I've asked them. Yeah. So and it is that, isn't it? That when it comes down to it, it's a process that needs to be managed. It's not just having a pension scheme, which is new to them, but it's this shift from the state providing an earnings-related second pension to employers having to do that, in the future.
And that takes us, and that brings the two subjects very nicely together in conclusion.
That was the idea.
One has to really dig down into the detail and understand what the hard wind-up of the second state pension means for lower earners and medium earners, middle income earners, and what auto-enrolment will provide for them as a replacement for that disappearance of SERPs, second state pension, and I think that's going to be a critical question as we go forward.
And that's something that you're pursuing in Parliament, or as we speak now.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, in that case, this probably won't be the last time we speak to you on Jargon Free, but Greg, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.